to the next. Sorry, I just got a warning up on the screen now. I wonder if anybody else did. At any rate, I hope by the end of this session, we'll have a blueprint for Sadiq as to what he might do over the next few months and next couple of years to address this most fundamental of issues. I say most fundamental of issues because I'm old enough to have spent more than 30 years working on environment, energy, climate change, sustainability, like some people in the audience. I guess it shows. And for a lot of this time, it felt like progress has been glacial and sometimes like we're going backwards. But I think we've seen a sea change over the last few years with political and wider commitment to addressing the twin existential crises of the climate emergency and the potential for ecosystem collapse, which threaten the very existence of civilization itself. That is not to say that the logic of that has been fully internalized, or indeed that the level of action is commensurate with the challenge. But nonetheless, that's been an important shift across the whole of society. Now, there are different aspects to all of this. We're going to focus on transport, but there is a context. And I think transport presents some particular challenges. When it comes to heat, for example, we kind of know what we do. It's got to do. It's very complex technically, but get the gas boilers out and get something else in instead. Ground source heat pumps, bit of hydrogen, bit of district heating, let's say. For electricity, again, massive challenge over storage and demand management, but fundamentally shift from fossil fuels to renewables, and depending on your point of view, to nuclear. Then I think it starts to get a little more tricky. I'm going to leave industrial processes and cement aside for a second, but it starts to get a little more tricky, like food. There's a next step between food production, between land use, between sequestration, rewilding, biodiversity protection. And when it comes to transportation, we think we know what we need to do. Shift to active travel, shared mobility, public transport. We think we know we've got lots of tools that are at our disposal, like smart road user charging, but putting them all together in a way that is politically sellable, that addresses social inequity as well, that addresses some really deep cultural questions, that's a challenge. Just to make this point, I don't care myself where my electron comes from, so long as it's green. And like a lot of people, so long as my house is warm, it doesn't really matter to me whether it's a ground source heat pump or a hydrogen boiler. But the car, now anybody who's been watching Euro 2020 over the past few weeks will have seen the adverts on ITV at halftime. It's full of advertisements for cars, not based on their utility or function, no, based on the lifestyle choice that you will make when you buy this vehicle. Why else do we spend tens of thousands of pounds for a lump of metal that sits outside unused for 95% of the time? And this question about the role of the car, the role of the alternatives, how we get about cities in a decarbonized way goes to the heart of who we are as individuals, what our urban spaces are for, how we project ourselves in our lives, how we design for the future in a profound way, and in a way that is so emotional and cultural and psychologically resonant as compared to some of these issues, apart from perhaps food. But I think the political challenges are enormous. So the question is, how is Sadiq Khan going to address these? Fortunately, we have experts to tell us how. So let's move on to hearing some of those answers. In a moment, we're going to have a panel debate, and I'm going to introduce the panelists when we get to that point in time. But to kick us off with a keynote presentation, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to introduce to you Becca Massey-Chase, who is at IPPR and is co-deputy head of the Environmental Justice Commission. Becca, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here this morning. I'm going to share my screen and share a presentation with you all, so I'll just do that before I start speaking. And if Simon, if you could give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Fantastic, that's brilliant, thank you very much. So decarbonising how people travel is something that we know we need to do. So how we do it well is the question we should be asking ourselves. And as I know, you know, across the UK and including London, the transport sector is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. And before the election, Sadiq Khan recommitted himself to making London zero carbon by 2030. In tackling the climate crisis, there's an opportunity to improve people's quality of life, to create new jobs, improve people's health and well-being, and increase fairness. And when thinking about decarbonising transport, there's been a significant focus on electrification of vehicles, shifting to electric cars. Now, we know that this is going to be fundamental to tackling the climate crisis through reducing emissions, and that cars will have some place in any transport system of the future. But in overemphasising cars, we miss the opportunities to tackle some of the endemic problems with our transport system, missing the opportunities for people to get around in ways that are better for them and the environment, and to tackle some of the inequalities people currently face in getting around. Inequalities such as that Londoners living in more deprived areas are more likely to suffer from the impacts of traffic, such as road danger, community severance, air pollution, whilst at the same time, the less you earn in London, the less likely you are to own and drive a car. As part of IPPR's new report on the topic of decarbonising transport, we provide some analysis of the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget, and the data that they shared with us shows how car use could actually increase over the coming years. So decarbonisation policies don't necessarily need to lead to a reduction in car use, or certainly aren't anticipated to necessarily lead to a reduction in car use. And in fact, the UK government currently forecasts up to 51% increases in traffic in England and Wales by 2050, by which time there's expected to be up to 10 million more cars on the road, taking the total to over 40 million. Now, those figures aren't London specific, but they show a broad trajectory that we shouldn't be ignoring. They also contain the message that you can decarbonise without reducing the number of cars. Now, that's not a future that I think we should be sleepwalking into. A path that focuses on electrification of the private car at the expense of other areas could lock in a more car-dependent future and still fail to tackle the climate and nature crises. So all vehicles draw on resources to be made, they all have an impact on the natural environment, and there's no such thing as emissions-free vehicle. And as Ashok said, they're sitting still in driveways and on streets most of the time. This isn't the future that people want to see. We should be looking at, when we're thinking about decarbonisation, to be moving into, on my screen, the top right-hand corner, it's about thinking about how we can take action that's really fast and effective on the climate and nature emergencies, but at the same time, increasing social and economic justice. There is an opportunity here to be seized. So that means that transport decarbonisation plans should be focused on providing everyone with the opportunity and the resources to make good transport choices. And that means, yes, access to an electric car if and when you need it, but clearly sort of taking that into a kind of a very clear context that we'll talk about much more, but also public transport that's affordable and comprehensive, walking and cycling routes that are safe and attractive, and particularly for children on the school run. That there needs to be a focus on making it possible for people to access what they need locally with services that communities have a stake in, provided across reimagined high streets. There needs to be a focus on creating welcoming green spaces for people and wildlife. There's this imperative for urgent action that I mentioned, this urgent need to decarbonise due to the climate crisis. And I think, Ashok made this point already, it's worth being clear that this argument is more or less won. The question is what and how we do it, and that's so pertinent when it comes to transport. But this imperative towards decarbonisation is met with a really significant opportunity to build on the changes that we've seen to travel over the last year that were created in response to COVID-19. So the last year's seen unprecedented restrictions on how and where people can travel. And it obviously goes without saying that COVID-19 has had devastating impacts on people's lives, and that the lockdowns required to protect the most vulnerable have restricted access to the fundamentals in people's lives, like family and work and education and friends. But also that through this experience, we've also had the opportunity to really, I think, sort of see and grasp the importance of the social functions of our streets and the public spaces around us. It's also exposed the extent to which motorised vehicles are, something that so many people are dependent on, impact on our environment and the nature that we share it with. And in addition to that, it's also shown people how much change is possible. So the effects of COVID have had, I think one of the sort of impacts they've had is to bring into sharp relief that the government has a really primary responsibility to keep the public safe from major shocks, challenges and threats to our society, and reminded us of the scale and the speed that government can act when the true nature of emergency is recognised. I think that's a really important context that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about what needs to happen next in terms of changing the way that we travel. As part of the work of the Environmental Justice Commission, we have run citizen juries across the country to gain the kind of different perspectives that people have on what should be done to tackle the climate and nature emergencies in a way that is fair for everyone. And through this, we've heard public opinion that is very much showing that there is a public demand for an alternative vision for transport decarbonisation, and that the principle, and they've also kind of shown us what principles they believe should underpin the changes to our transport system. So I'm going to share a little bit about that with you. And their views and recommendations point towards what ambitious, bold and fair action to reduce emissions from transport could look like. And that issue of fairness is, I think, the main kind of topic that I really want to focus on in this part of the session today. At the heart of what the people that we spoke to told us is that there are core principles about putting well-being and fairness at the heart of decision making, supporting people to make choices that meet their needs, and that those choices need to be affordable. Their recommendations fall into sort of three broad themes around the importance of a shift away from cars, the importance of providing really good alternatives, that people want to be able to access what they need locally, that needs to be possible, and that there needs to be a shift in prioritisation towards people and nature on our streets. We also ran a listening campaign in London with Citizens UK, through which we connected with 706 Londoners from across a range of schools and non-profits and faith institutions, and they were all invited to discuss which issues mattered most to them, and crucially where they wanted to see action by the next mayor of London. So we ran this prior to the election, and transport wasn't a core theme of the discussion, but the messages that we heard did come up, and the messages that we heard through the exercise, which very much chime with what we heard through the citizen juries that we ran, which were in Aberdeenshire, Tees Valley and County Durham, the South Wales Valleys and Thurrock. The core messages that we had from all of these sort of listening and citizen engagement exercises was that action on climate and nature can and must tackle injustices and fairness, and that the public and poorer communities in particular must have a stake in and help lead the transition to a greener and fairer economy. And I think this is something that's already been touched on by Ashok in the introduction, but when we're thinking about tackling the climate crisis, what happens next is going to affect the day-to-day lives of people more than ever before. If we think about the transition to renewable energy, for example, as Ashok said, it's not something that necessarily impacts your day-to-day life. It's not felt in the way that what we eat and how we get about and those sorts of things are felt, and those things are going to be a huge priority in the next few years. That means that the public must have a stake in those decisions that affect them. That unless the transition is done in partnership with communities and reflects their hopes and concerns, it's not going to be as successful. And we can take the example, and I'm sure this is a topic that we'll come back to over the course of this event, is the topic of low traffic neighbourhoods. So clearly these have been designed to improve public health and increase walking and cycling, and there's really compelling evidence of their positive impact, and within the most deprived neighbourhoods, but that these schemes have provoked significant opposition, fuelled in part by anger at a perception that they benefit the wealthiest over the poorest. And whilst there have been many schemes that have been quietly and successfully put in place with public support, there are isolated examples that have been used to tell a story about a lack of consultation and the potential for traffic to be pushed from wealthy neighbourhoods to the main roads and those on lower incomes where they tend to live. And so the legitimate concerns of local residents being amplified by media, by social and traditional media, into a much kind of wider story about a rejection of schemes has a real potential to sort of derail these sorts of activities. And yet they have the potential to deliver such significant, tangible health and social benefits, as well as being part of how we need to be going about decarbonising our transport system. And that I think really underlines that the perception of fairness is really important to it. Things need to be fair, they need to feel to be fair, and the public won't accept change if it isn't. And that in practice, that we the public, have a veto on climate and nature policies, a veto that can be exercised at the ballot box or in the streets, as demonstrated by the Gilets Jaunes movement in France. And that, I think, points to the importance of citizen engagement. And that's something that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more. And it's not just IPPR's Environmental Justice Commission that's gone to engage with the public on these sorts of issues. There have been a range of climate assemblies and citizen juries held across the UK since 2019, and in particular some in London. And so I think there have been about 16 of these sorts of events since 2019, with conclusions that are relevant to transport, with conclusions that have been published and involve, have a really good, you can find out more about all of these from them. And they've all presented quite common themes on transport. And one of those is that fairness means getting the timing right. And there's also been an incentive, also been an emphasis from these different groups about incentives over penalties. So, and this is something that we very much heard from the groups that we spoke to, that people don't want to feel like they're being punished for decisions which they feel they don't have as much of an ability to change as that they would want to have. That incentives are more effective than penalties when it comes to changing behaviour. This is something that a lot of the people that we spoke with said. And I think the kind of key message that I feel like we want to take away from this is actually, though, that there is a public appetite for change. And so, looking at the screen, there's there's huge public support for public transport, for cycling and walking, for making it easier for children to go to school in a way that's good for them and their health. That people are really concerned about air quality, and they want to see differences made to that. They want to create more green space or residential streets. I think probably policymakers underestimate the significant public support for some of the things that a lot of the people in this room will want to be talking about today. So, to come to the kind of the key question of this morning. So, we know that the mayor can make a dramatic impact on the lives of Londoners. And that he has powers over transport and planning. He has a coordinating role for green space, health inequalities, housing. He has the potential to make a lot happen. So what does need to happen? What needs to happen now? And I'm really looking forward to hearing the other panelists to put forward their ideas. I think I'm going to take a slightly broader, more kind of principle-based approach here as a way to open up this discussion. And so firstly, I would say that Sadiq Khan needs to put people at the heart of decision-making, ensure that policies are fair and seem to be fair. And this is, I think, what really, really important, and in terms of ensuring fairness, and things like citizen juries have a really crucial role, because they're not just involving a particular perspective from a particular member of the public. They take people in a group together through a process of deliberation. And from a fairness perspective, that means that different people are able to hear the different lived experiences that help them to arrive at recommendations that reflect that variety of experience. So I think I would certainly say, through the experience that we have of the Environmental Justice Commission, that citizen juries have a really important role to play. And when it comes to what needs to happen in London, I think one of the recommendations I think would be really interesting is when we're thinking about road user charging and how that is equitable and fair. I would suggest that there's a really important role for civil citizen participation in that decision, and that something like a citizen jury on road user charging would be a really positive step for Sadiq to make. I think Sadiq Khan's transport decarbonisation plan needs to set out a vision for the transport system that people want to see, and that vision should be about prioritising fairness and well-being. So often decision-making frameworks on transport are too focused on a certain type of person making a certain type of journey, and not reflecting the kind of breadth of people and experiences in London, and often an overemphasis on economic factors, not taking into account the broader things that matter to people. And through the work that we've done and the people we spoke with, they've said that they want decisions to be informed by well-being, by what how
Okay, it looks like Becca is having some technical difficulties. We will give her a moment or two just to see if they resolve themselves. If not, then we will move on to the panel debate. I think we may have to come back to Becca. Okay, right. Sorry about that, everybody. This is a peril of using online technologies. It's happened to me. I really sympathize with Becca. I sympathize with you because you won't be able to hear the end of her comments. So I'm going to move forward to the panel debate. Just before we do so, this whole idea of, which I said at the top, of the trajectory towards a decarbonised road system by 2030. I'm really looking forward to the IPPI's Environmental Justice Commission's final report being published in a couple of weeks. We have also produced our own blueprint called Climate Safe Streets at LCC. So I'm sure somebody is going to be putting it into the chat so you can access the link and access the update report. And the original report was done in conjunction with Brian's team at Urban Movement. Okay, let's move on to the panel debate now. We have some excellent, as I mentioned earlier, excellent and erudite panelists for you this morning. Brian, I mentioned a moment ago, Brian Deegan is Technical Director for Walking and Cycling at Urban Movement. Susan Claris is a Transport Planner at Arup and Vice President of Living Streets. Dr. Debbie Hopkins is an Associate Professor of Human Geography at Oxford. And Adam Tyndall is Programme Director for Connectivity at London First. And of course, we have our very own Eminence Grise, I hope you won't mind me calling it that, Simon Monk, our Senior Infrastructure Campaigner at LCC. So I'm going to take it more or less in the order that I read them out. Each panelist will have 2 minutes to introduce their take on what Sadiq must do over the next couple of years. And then we'll open up to the conversation to questions from the floor. There are going to be some polls, which we're also going to be simultaneously running, which I hope through the magic of technology and the efforts of one of my colleagues behind the scenes will pop up in front of you. You'll be able to give your views on those polls, and I will read out the results at an appropriate moment during the course of the conversation. So let us kick off then, 2 minutes each from each of our panelists. Brian, can I invite you to take the stage first, please?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ashok. And yeah, just I want to talk about really in my 2 minutes, my letter to the mayor, really. And it was really good to be involved in the Climate Safe Streets report. And I really took that as an opportunity to say, dear Mayor, please think about all these bits of research. So I was trying to cram in all the stuff that I felt was the most vital. I think in my 2 minutes, I'm going to mention one thing, and this really leads into the kind of challenge of what happens next and the thing I want the mayor to do next. So the report I'm going to mention is from 2012 now, and it was like cost-effective actions for cutting air pollution in central London. I'll say it quickly, and I'll put a link into the report to it. But what I really liked about this, I worked with like an air quality specialist, and my contribution was like, what if we built the cycle network? What if we actually delivered infrastructure? And it's one of the few reports I know of that says, if you do this, you'll reduce CO2, you'll reduce particulates, you'll reduce nitrous oxides by this amount based on actually doing this. And that's really my big ask for the mayor. I think every scheme should go through that process. I want to see like, here's where we are, here's where zero is, here's how much and how are the schemes you're doing relating to that, and are we going to get there or not on that year by year reporting. And I think it can go down to individual scheme basis, and everything that the mayor does now should be like, it shouldn't be neutral, it should be tackling into that target. So there are some good targets from the mayor about the 80% of trips by active modes, but I really want to see it scheme by scheme and intervention by intervention of like how we're putting that down. But frankly, like 9 years isn't a lot of time, and really like I first looked at doing this kind of quantification in 2012, and it's not really become mainstream, but it needs to do that. And for me, it needs to happen in the next 6 to 7 months. So that's my call to the mayor, to think about that, quantify everything, and really get on the front foot with this. Like we can't have the Mayor of London waiting for like national policy. Like the Mayor of London should be setting it for the rest of the UK to follow. And I think that they have been doing lots of great stuff over the last 18 months, but they really need to get on this decarbonisation plan. And they've got the brains at Transport for London to do it. I know that because they used to work for them. They can all quantify and start doing this thing and start making sure that we all tackling the CO2 in particular with every individual scheme. So that's my message, like show me the figures and show me the plan. Thanks.
That's really very, very good. Show me the figures, show me the plan. And of course, London has to develop the proof of concept. We have to prove it's possible so we can generate the momentum as well as learning from elsewhere. Okay, Susan, over to you. Your 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. My focus is on walking as much as cycling. And I think I noted what Becca said about incentive being more effective than penalties. And sadly, I'm not entirely sure that I share that view. She mentioned that there's a lot of public support for change and support in this room, but my concern is the people who are not in this room. So my message to the Mayor is to be stronger and braver in addressing what I refer to as transport gluttony. And by that, I mean the overconsumption of transport to the detriment of others. Typical examples are the amount of SUVs in London, when I think they largely have no place in this city or completely have no place in this city, the amount of engine idling, the behaviours of people not waiting at crossings, of going through red lights, of parking on the footway, and it's that bravery that's required for that. So I think we do need a London-wide scheme of road pricing. I welcome the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, but that only goes a certain way. There's a lot of London outside the North and South Circular. And I think it is that bravery and how we bring the public along with those decisions to actually address transport gluttony. Because until you do that, people won't feel as safe as they could do cycling. They certainly won't feel as safe as they could do walking. And I think the real push for walking and cycling is to make it attractive for everybody, as opposed to for the brave. There are a lot of groups who do not walk and cycle at the moment because they feel safe, or they feel unsafe rather, or they feel that cycling is not for them. So I think alongside this addressing transport gluttony, we need to have a real push to make sure that walking and cycling is as inclusive as possible, is open to everybody, and is as attractive as everybody. And that way, I think we will help with the decarbonisation sort of mantra of avoiding trips in the first place, then shifting them, and then the last resort is improve. Thank you very much.
Cracking stuff, Susan. Couldn't agree more. We had a very great success as LCC back in 2012 in persuading Boris to adopt a Dutch-style approach to cycling infrastructure. But since then, we've learned that isn't enough, and we need to do more to make sure that. And I'm talking about cycling now, but this also applies to walking. To make sure our urban spaces are truly inclusive. We'll come back to that in the discussion, I am sure. Debbie, over to you now, please, for your 2 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, really great to be here. Susan, that was really interesting. I agree with everything you just said. I wanted to talk about freight a little bit, which is often excluded from these types of conversations, but it's so intricately connected to how people are moving. Obviously, if you've been on a bike and you've been in a bike lane, you'll often get frustrated because that bike lane is covered by a van kind of parked off on the road as somebody's trying to run in and deliver a parcel, and we get very frustrated with that van. But actually our freight system hasn't been successfully integrated into conversations about urban transport systems. Often it's left to the private sector. The infrastructure is designed in ways that aren't consistent, and it's the drivers actually that are on the coalface, right? They're the people that are experiencing a lot of our frustrations as cyclists or pedestrians, and they're running in and out. It's these extreme kind of time pressures that are leading to these immensely inefficient practices and immensely problematic. And so we know that the vast majority of road-based emissions come from cars, over 60%, but actually we get 16% from HGVs, heavy good vehicle, and another 16% from vans. Not all of those vans are freight, but we know that there are a lot of emissions, and considering that only 5% of vehicle kilometers traveled are from HGVs, their emissions are really important. So my pitch, I guess, to Sadiq Khan would be freight has to be brought into this conversation. The freight and logistics system, we've seen through COVID that urban logistics has just proliferated through home delivery of food, of Deliveroo type models. We need to be thinking about how all of this works as well. We need to be thinking about the possibility of urban consolidation centres, of electrifying some small vehicles, of thinking of cargo bikes, of different different systems of delivery for our cities. And only if we include freight in that conversation have we got any chance of meeting any of the objectives and the goals that we want. So thank you.
Debbie, you are so right. And we have to confess, we said it up front when we produced our Climate Safe Streets report, we did say there is an area that we're not addressing yet because we don't necessarily know what to do. And I think it's sometimes important to say that, and that is freight. So again, I'm sure that is something we will pick up once more in the course of this conversation. Welcome back, Becky. Becca, I'm so sorry you had technical difficulties, but I think we can circulate your slides. I'm sure I'll check and see whether that's possible. I'm sorry about that. We had to move on. And our final panelist, Adam from London First, your 2 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Ashok. For those of you who don't know, London First is a not-for-profit business membership organisation with a mission to make London the best city in the world in which to do business. So that's where we're coming from. What should Sadiq do? He's got a 3-year term. That's a third of those 9 years to 2030. And if we think about what he is going to be judged on at the end of that, I think both have transport at their absolute core. One is getting the city back to growth, back to life, back to being an exciting, buzzy international place that we all love after the pandemic. And the second, which will very much define whether or not he achieves the first, is the strength of the public transport network that he leaves behind. TfL is still a relatively young institution. It's only been around for 21 years. It's done a lot in that time in terms of modal shift, particularly to public transport. And I think we often forget how far we've come in the last 2 or 3 decades. And of course, the pandemic has fully broken TfL's funding model. And the one thing that will probably do more to define Sadiq's second term than anything else is the funding deal that he manages to negotiate with Treasury and with central government. And that will either be something that sets us up for success, including on decarbonisation, or not. Alongside this, there's a bunch of stuff we can do around encouraging people back onto public transport. We were given the impression that public transport was uniquely risky at the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of the evidence suggests that it's not. And the mayor should be leading the charge on that, so that we avoid a car-led recovery, which we are already seeing in large parts of the city where road traffic is back at the levels it was before. And these people will be forming new habits. Our normal life has been disrupted. People will be forming new habits over the coming years, and this will have an impact on long-term behaviour. So the one thing that I would say on all of this is Sadiq can't do pretty much anything alone. He has to work with central government, he has to work with business, he has to work with Londoners, he has to work with the boroughs. On roads, of course, the boroughs control 95% of London's roads. So even if he does everything he wants from a TfL perspective, that's only going to touch the sides. Funding is another good example. Big transition to electric vehicles. We're doing a lot of work on data sharing, to Brian's point about data, between the public and private sector, to work out where that infrastructure needs to go first. On freight, to Debbie's point, we're soon to release a report which builds on our recommendation from before the election for a freight servicing and delivery SAR at City Hall to really coordinate, because coordination, strategy, leadership, convening all the messy, creative, innovative parts of the London ecosystem together and setting out a plan that, for example, on private cars has a clear target not to end up with just as many electric private cars as there are ICE private cars right now. The one lever that he does have almost real control over is, of course, road pricing, as we've seen with the congestion charge. And I think we need to, the sorts of people, I'm making sweeping assumptions here, but the sorts of people who are probably listening to this need to meet the politicians who have internalized that road pricing is the third rail of politics halfway. We need to stop designing the perfect, environmentally ideal, economically crisp solution, and we need to work out where that centre ground is. I think Becca's suggestions around citizens' juries is something that we've been thinking about too, and I'd love to pick that up with you afterwards, because congestion is a big part of this, and it will, to bring us right back round, will London continue to be one of the great global cities? Part of that is about decarbonisation, but part of that is about what type of decarbonisation and whether we end up with a city that's just as exciting on the other side of all of this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam. Right, now I'm going to pose some questions to you, questions that have occurred to me, but also questions that are coming through to me from the floor, which my colleague is feeding to me. I'm certainly going to come back to some of these issues around the boroughs, freight, inclusivity. But I'm actually going to start with what you mentioned, Adam, road pricing. And so that we can get through plenty of questions. If you all want to make a comment, that's great, but don't feel you have to. 2 or 3 comments in each question will be absolutely fine. Road pricing, though, I get the citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, but it still feels to me that no matter what we do in those kind of microcosms, they will be microcosms of wider society, we've still got to find a way of making road pricing saleable beyond just those assemblies and juries to the community at large. So what's the balance between political ambition, like you said, Susan, and public engagement, so that we can get to a place where road pricing of some form is instituted as quickly as possible? What do you think? Who wants to tackle that one? Is it so thorny that no? Okay, go for it, Brad. Very brave.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna, just because it was one of the key things that we put in the Climate Safe Streets reports that we're talking about, and really the way I think to frame it and the way we tried to do it in the document was the kind of polluter pays principle, which I think everybody can get in a kind of decarbonisation air quality plan. The fact that, you know, we put all the stats in about how much everybody's subsidising private car use, and it goes over to Susan's point as well. So the fact that, like, you're polluting if you're driving a car around London, and you know someone needs to pay for that damage to the environment, for the people that are killed from collisions. It's all like an ongoing tax to society that at the moment, like the mayor's heavily subsidising, and everybody in the UK is, and we show all the figures for that. So for me, if you just address it around the polluter pays, we've got this target again, it needs to reduce. This is what's causing it. We need to start charging you for it. And the more we can charge people for it, the more we can subsidise buses, the more we can make better walking and cycling environments and start providing really attractive, safe, healthy alternatives. So for me, that's the way to frame it. Just like who's polluting needs to pay for the damage they do. Just to start us off on that.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. I had signals from Susan and then Simon. Susan.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how few cities around the world have managed to introduce road pricing schemes, let alone a successful one. But I think the interesting model is Stockholm some years ago now, where they introduced it as a trial and then had a referendum whether people wanted to keep it or not. And that way, it was introduced with support, so that took out the risk. And I think it's de-risking it. It's enabling people to see the change. So it's a bit like some of the trial schemes we've seen so far, but much bigger. And I find it interesting that I don't think any other city has adopted that model, and that could be a way forward for London.
Excellent. I do wholly agree with that, Susan, from what I've seen. Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I think road pricing is absolutely going to be vital, and TfL's finance is going to be part of the issue here. But the big thing here is not just do we have to bring Londoners with us, which is absolutely vital, but we also face a situation where if Sadiq doesn't get a move on road pricing, it's entirely possible that the government will start working on their own scheme anyway. So there is a real issue of joined up thinking here across the nation as well as in London that needs to be tackled. The only other thing I'd say on road pricing is, we absolutely, I think, and this goes back to Susan's point in earlier, is we really have to face this issue of how we allocate space on our roads and priority. If we cannot start to do that, we will face a car-led recovery, and that will go on and on. So I think road pricing is one of many mechanisms we have to look at very seriously.
Very good. I'm going to move us on to another question, but before I do that, I'm going to give you the results of the poll, the question was, given TfL's finances and car use in London, is smart road user charging inevitable? The top answer at 45% was yes, but the technology and Londoners' views will push it into the next mayoralty, followed closely by at 42% yes, and Sadiq will need to do it by 2024. So that is the view from the floor. Can I pick up on some of the questions that everybody's talked about in relation to inclusivity, social justice, inequalities. Now we're seeing this played out to a certain extent in the fraught and not always well-informed debates around low-traffic neighbourhoods, for example. And there's a real sense. I hear what you're saying, Brian, about polluter pays principle, but people don't feel that they're bad when they're driving a car. They don't feel like doing a bad thing. And they feel that some of these changes are negatively impacting on their ways that are disproportionate. So it's a big question. What can Sadiq do to roll out provision of more facilitation for walking, cycling, walking and cycling, and widen the provision for public transport in a way that people really feel is socially equitable and is not demonizing them if they happen to be drivers? What do you think? Anybody want to pick that up?
Well, I mean,
so I've got Adam and then Brian.
Just to link those two things together, because I'm not sure that I fully agree with Brian. He's absolutely right on the facts and the rational approach, but this is ultimately about people's feelings, and people have grown up feeling like they have a right to drive their car around. And I think the other, I mean, to Susan's point, Stockholm's a great example, but so is London in 2003. And the real lessons from that, I think, are about ensuring that alternatives are there before you start bringing in the penalties. I think Ken had absolute clarity on needing to expand the bus network, and the communication around what are you doing, why are you doing it, and what change will it bring. And the congestion charge was very clear on that, and it met its objectives. And in the years following its introduction, congestion came down, and Londoners and London businesses felt like that was a trade-off that they could win. And I think that if we need to show people the prize for their daily lives, as well as because the flip side of this is that if we go purely with Brian's polluter pays model, people go, but I'm switching to an EV, and they think that's their bit done.
Good point. Brian, you have the right of reply, so to speak, and then I'll invite Simon and Debbie, and we'll move on to the next question after that.
I think to be honest, we're violently agreeing, and a switch to EV is going to be a start. So all right, let's do that, and then we'll persuade you on the next stage. And what I wanted to say is that we've already got a mandate for these kind of changes. People are time and time again, Londoners in the vast majority are saying we want nice low traffic neighbourhoods, we want cycling provision, we want this stuff in there. So to an extent, I think like the will of the public is there, and yes, every view is important, but it's certainly like if you're getting on the right foot as the mayor, you can't just let like a few voices destroy it. Albeit like when it comes to the business voice, that's always going to be a really powerful one. So I'm with you there. I always make sure that freight's sorted and that the businesses can operate, and they go, okay, well actually there's a bus there. Do all those people need to be sat in their cars? You start like tackling it like that, and we can give people actually what they want, and people are demanding change. And it's like it's been happening quickly in the last 18 months, but we've got to maintain that momentum and increase it. But I think the mandate's there from the people of London, and the vast majority of it, well, the majority of whom don't own cars. Let's start with that. So yeah, I do think we're on the right foot here.
Thank you, Brian. Debbie and Simon, and then we will move on to the next question. Debbie.
Hi, I just wanted to take up something that Adam said as well about moving to EVs, and going back to the issue of sort of equity, is that it's wealthy people that are buying EVs, and that car ownership is occasionally forced, and that people may not necessarily be choosing to have that car. They may be in a condition that means that they require that car for a variety of different reasons, be it mental, physical health, well-being, or some other issue as well. And so when we create these issues that mean that wealthy people are able to buy themselves out of, the amount of money isn't such a big issue for them, or they are able to get an EV and therefore not have to pay the charges, and then we further perpetuate the issues that we already have about these very unequal transport systems, albeit with good intentions behind them.
Simon?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the missing ingredients in all of this is that kind of real clarity of leadership, to be frank. I think one of the things that we need to see, during the crisis and in the run out of it in the DfT, TfL negotiations. Sadiq said, about his boundary charge idea, this is, we have to look at how we replace the money that we're losing. And he was very clear about the options, but that's a very rare action for him, in my view. We really need this kind of someone to say, this is why we need to start considering these things. This is the options that we face as London, and as England and as the nation. These are how we move forward on these. There are choices to be made, but those choices all have consequences and pros and cons, and here they are. And I think that's why I'm really impressed by Becca's citizen jury idea as well. And seeing the citizen juries across London have really, you can see Londoners start to grapple with these issues. But I think someone needs to set out that case very clearly.
Thank you, Simon. We haven't mentioned shared mobility in relation to all of this. I do think that giving people a really good alternative to a private motor car charged when you use it, whether it's e-scooter if they become legal in the future, or car sharing. I think that, as we said in our report, I think that's got a massive role to play. Anyway, moving on. Fraser Moore has posed a question for Debbie, but I'm also going to invite others to respond to it. This is a real geographer's question, this one. It says, what issues, if any, does London's geography, quite large and sprawling, pose in terms of sustainable freight? And he goes on to say, people often say that solutions such as cargo bikes are unrealistic due to this. Is this true?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I mean, obviously, we treat cities as somewhat of a, a bounded space, and we often make assumptions about where freight can stop. So, for example, the urban consolidation centre idea is really restricted by land prices, right? Because you want it close enough to the city that you can access places as easy as possible by cargo bikes or e-vans, but often you can only really afford the land that's further out. So then you are really restricted to just using vans. And I guess the idea being for a city the size of London that you wouldn't just have, I mean, urban consolidation centres, in my mind, there needs to be there's not one form of urban consolidation centre, but there needs to be something along those lines. And actually it needs somebody like Sadiq Khan to come in and push this forward, because it doesn't happen from the private sector on its own. But there would need to be multiple to account for all of the, the size of London. And it wouldn't just be cargo bikes, right? It would need to be cargo bikes, it would need to be electric vans, it would need to be a range of different, because we're still going to have construction in the City of London, we're still going to require HGVs coming into London. This is not to say that we're going to be able to do away with HGVs on London's roads, but that there would need to be maybe a slightly more fragmented model of organising how things get into the city and are moved around the city, but it requires some centralised organisation, because we've seen in many examples around the world that consolidation centres really require some support, and it needs that kind of overview, as well as some of because I know that there's lots of freight companies in London doing really wonderful things.
Good. Adam, you were shaking your head at the proposition that London was too big to make this work. What would you like to say?
So I would agree with what Debbie said. I think, London is varied more than it's big, actually. We have incredibly dense areas in the central activities zone that drive a huge portion of the demand for a lot of this activity. And that is an area where it is realistic to shift a huge proportion of this onto more sustainable delivery modes, and places like the City of London are leading the way on this with micro consolidation centres and things. The other two quick things to mention on this: we need to think about deliveries. We need to think about parcel deliveries, and we are way behind a number of particularly Scandinavian nations on out-of-home collection points, click and collect lockers, as an alternative to all the vans driving around dropping off 7 Amazon parcels at the same front door every day. And we need to think about how, and this goes back to the point in our report that's coming out in a couple of weeks around a freight servicing and delivery staff, to really knock heads together and get that coordination across the city. And we need to think about non-road ways of getting into, inner London. So there are various trials going on bringing freight from Heathrow down the river into central London, bringing freight from the ports in East London into Liverpool Street Station, and then out from there. And so we need to learn from the successes in our own city as we're trialing these things. But again, until there's a focal point for this, at the moment in TfL, freight is spread across every single team. There is no one focal point. There is no one at that top table of City Hall decision making the case for freight and inserting freight into these conversations. And that's why we think that we need that focal point to really drive change in this sector.
Excellent. Thank you for that contribution, Adam. Susan, were you signaling that you want to intervene on this topic?
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up build on the point that Adam was saying. I think freight is often is too big a catch-all, and I think we need to talk about the different types of freight servicing and delivery. And my concern is the proliferation of local deliveries. And it isn't just parcels, you know, it is people having their lunch delivered or a sandwich delivered, increasing use of vans. And I have enormous sympathy for the people that make those deliveries. I think it must be one of the hardest jobs going, but it does make for a worse walking and cycling environment. We are seeing more use of cargo bikes, electric bikes, and I think things need to be done to actually increase their usage, because I said otherwise it will just make things harder to walk and cycle.
Very good points indeed, Susan. Let us move on once again. We have 8 minutes left. I do want to cover two key issues that have come up. One is boroughs, and the other one is inclusivity. Now, I think, you know, we have a Labour mayor who's set an agenda for net zero London by 2030. We have a Conservative government that has agreed to accept the recommendations of this Climate Change Committee. Sixth carbon budget, a 78% reduction compared to 1990 levels by 2035. So there is political alignment here. Yet here we are in London, 32 boroughs, City of London. I don't think there's political alignment personally about this decarbonisation trajectory in detail and how to get there. Yet we're going to have common purpose. We're going to have partnerships. We're going to have a coherent set of tools that are applied consistently across the capital. How are we going to get there? Who wants to pick that up? Brian.
Yeah, I mean, because I've spent my career working with all 33 boroughs and local authorities in London and trying to get them coordinated, particularly around cycle networks. So I've got to jump on it. So I just wanted to mention like the place-based CO2 footprint calculator that Creds have just put out there, which I was looking at before I went here, and it was really interesting because you can put all the super output areas, all the little neighbourhoods, and see what their CO2 footprints are. And you can overlay where the bus stops are and how well used they are, and overlay where like the cycling trips are from the PCC tool. And it's, you know, it just gives you that full geographical view of London and the issue. And I know correlation doesn't necessarily equal cause, but all the lower CO2 footprints happen to tie in with where all the established cycle network is. And all the areas that are left behind have got like poor bus usage and hardly any cycling. So I think like there has to be some kind of scientific conclusions done from those. And you can, and what I like about that tool as well, you can pick out the individual areas and go, well, okay, why are your neighbours okay and why are you not? And really, again, it's that whole narrative of framing everything around decarbonisation from now on. We've done other things, but for the next like 10, 20 years of our lives, it's got to be about that. And just the parallels are enormous in that. So I think that's a good way of starting the conversations. And look, you're showing bright red here on your CO2 footprint. Can we put a bus route in there? Can we get some cycling? Can we make this connection that we've been trying to talk you in for 20 years? And just for the general public to start looking at that and going, why is my air quality so bad? Why are we producing so much? I think it's all getting out there and people are starting to do their own personal CO2 accounting as well. And I think that's only going to grow and grow and people are going to ask these questions. I'm hoping that's the way. I've always got to hope that I'll bring in all the 33 boroughs in line and all the individual wards and all the individual councils in line as well. That's the big thing that we've got to look at. So yeah, just to throw in on that. Complex, but there's some really good tools for helping you analyze it now, I have to say.
That's a really good reminder of the starting point, the data and the analytic tools. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to refine the question slightly to take us back to politics. What should Sadiq Khan do to help bring all the boroughs on board as part of a shared agenda and vision and program of action? What should the boroughs be doing to support the mayor and London-wide to achieve this outcome of a net zero road transport system by 2030. Anybody else want to pick it up? It's a tough one, isn't it?
I would come in again on the politics side if you want.
Please do.
Well, you know, I get to work with a few mayors around the country, and I've already watched some questions out with Andy Burnham and his approach to every single ward in Greater Manchester voted for him by a majority, and they're all kind of buying into it. And I like to think there's a few techniques that we've used that are learned from lessons in London that we applied, and it goes back to right the way back started on this, like citizen involvement and collaborative planning. And that's what we did from the get-go on active travel in Greater Manchester, and everybody bought into it as a result. So just an advert for the first bit. If you want political will, you've got to show that people actually want it, and the way you find out what people actually want is involving them in it. We've all got big decisions about our behaviour and the way we change our lives, and when people start to get into it, you start engaging the politicians, and you get that kind of groundswell. So, you know, shout out to Andy Burnham, but I didn't think he did show a different way of doing politics, where it wasn't like all about party allegiances. It was more about coming together to actually deliver a cause, and London needs a little bit of that at the moment, I feel. So,
very strong challenge from the north to the south. Thank you, Brian. Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to, you know, Becca, I read the report from IPPR and Becca on citizen juries, and it's striking. You know, you've got Thurrock, which is, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, wild East country for car owners and drivers in East London. I'm an East London man myself, I hasten to add. So, you know, it's surprising and informative that even out there, you know, you've got people very clearly talking about moving away from cars, very clearly recognizing these issues. We have to take the conversation away from the politicians in a way here. You know, we have to start to have a conversation that cuts across party lines and says, you know what, it's not okay. It's not, you know, we know that broadly the voting patterns in some of the bits of the outer London boroughs, quite car dominated areas. We know about central London, etc. We've got to start stepping away from just letting politicians kind of run everything as in that way. And I think having citizens start to talk back is got to be part of that.
I have Becca and then Debbie. Please go ahead, Becca.
Just briefly to build on that, and I absolutely agree, Simon. I think that there has been, I think, a surprising message from these juries over to the extent to which they want to see change, the extent to which they want to see alternatives to the car, that the car provides them with something at the moment that they feel they can't get elsewhere, but they want the thing maybe more than they want the car. And I think sometimes like disentangling that, you know, we've been a bit of a victim of emphasizing one thing more than the other. But I'd also build on the idea that, yes, we moving the conversation away from politicians and into the community, but there's also so many other stakeholders we need to be involved in this conversation. And I think there's some really encouraging signs of different kind of examples of cross-sector working. So things like the Healthy Streets scorecard being a really good example of collaboration. I think, you know, the role for so many people in doing this well. I think there's a lot of sort of opportunity for optimism there, but more, you know, more needs to be done, definitely.
Becca, thank you. And thank you also for advertising the Healthy Streets Scorecard Coalition's work. The annual iteration, this year's iteration of the scorecard is going to be launched next Tuesday. I forget the precise time. It's in the morning. Somebody will inform me. At any rate, if you're on our e-list, and if you're not on our e-list, why? You will find out when it is with absolute precision in due course. Debbie, over to you.
Thank you. I don't want to be a pessimistic voice here, but I also want maybe a word of caution about overstating consensus and actually overstating the importance of consensus, because I think that there are diverging opinions and some of these people don't attend these types of events for a variety of reasons, and we risk excluding them further by suggesting that there is consensus and by moving away from engaging with those forms of dissensus as being important in and of themselves, and maybe vilifying people who do want their cars, and rather than that that narrative, I think it would be productive to engage with them on their own terms, and to be actually spending time, rather than seeking consensus, actually seeking dissensus, and understanding that dissensus, understanding why there are these perspectives, because I have a fear that when we turn up to climate events, we tend to already have self-selected as people that are immensely concerned about climate and immensely engaged with thinking about our carbon, and we do know from a range of kind of academic literatures as well about the importance of thinking about some of the more marginal perspectives, even where there is consensus. So I think that that's an important thing for us to be doing as well.
Thank you, Debbie. Sorry, Becca, we're actually out of time, but I'm going to prevail upon people's patience by trying to round up and by doing something incredibly cruel and heartless, which is to put each one of you on the spot, 10 seconds each. One thing. Sadiq Khan is in the elevator with you in City Hall right now, and you're going to suggest to him that there's one thing that he could and should do to get us on this trajectory to zero carbon roads by 2030. 10-second elevator pitch. I will go around my screen. Simon, because you're a colleague, you can take the floor first to give people thinking time.
Cars. It's the cars. We've just got to deal with the cars.
Okay. Susan.
Be bold about addressing transport gluttony with strong leadership.
Brilliant. You write his sound bites, don't you?
I wish I could.
Citizen jury on road user charging.
Excellent. Debbie.
Engage with the freight sector.
Adam.
Fair and sustainable funding deal for TfL that leads to more public transport, not less.
Amen to that, Adam. Brian.
Eliminate private car use on the TLRN, the Transport for London Rail Network. Get that done. That'll get us on the right foot.
Thank you so much, Brian. Well, we didn't quite get to a blueprint for Sadiq Khan, but if Sadiq was listening or watching, he will have seen plenty of food for thought. So thank you ever so much to all of you, our esteemed guests and panelists. People are applauding in the background, I am sure already. I'm sorry to those of you who posed questions that I couldn't address during the short time that's available to us, but there'll be other opportunities. I am sure, not least as we have very, very important local elections next year, which have to be, I would say this, wouldn't I, the climate elections, otherwise we are going to run out of time. So I'm sure we'll reconvene one way or another. It's been a very great pleasure to host you this morning. Thank you all for your contributions. My fellow panelists, thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us this morning. I'll plug it again. Stay tuned with what LCC does by signing up to our e-list. And I look forward to the next occasion when our paths will meet. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye for now.